Hi, and welcome to the Archive of History. Imagine a city where every citizen was expected to debate the laws that governed them. A place where theatre was not entertainment but a civic duty, where the plays performed could determine the fate of empires. Where the marketplace was not just for buying bread and olive oil but for dissecting the very nature of reality itself, where strangers would stop you in the street to ask what justice truly means, what virtue requires, whether the soul is immortal. Before we drift off, I am always curious to know where my listeners are tuning in from and what time it is that they are listening tonight. Let me know in the comments. Tonight we journey to a place that changed the course of human thought forever, a city that should not have been able to exist but did, and in existing transformed everything that came after. This is Athens in the 5th century before Christ, the birthplace of reason, democracy, and tragedy. Here in this single city of perhaps 40,000 citizens, perched on a rocky peninsula jutting into the wine-dark Aegean Sea, ideas were born that still shape how we think, how we govern, how we love, and how we question the world around us. Every word you speak about politics, every question you ask about the nature of truth, every play you watch in a darkened theatre, every vote you cast in an election, carries within it the echo of this place, the DNA of Athenian innovation. It is dawn just before the sun breaks over the mountains of Hymettus to the east. The air is cool and sharp with the scent of wood smoke from 1,000 cooking fires and the distant salt of the sea carried on the morning breeze. The sky is turning from deep purple to pale, rose to pale blue, and the first light is touching the summit of the hills that surround the city like a protective embrace. The streets are still mostly empty, but they will not be for long. Now, let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let the glow of screens and the hum of engines dissolve into silence. Let the concerns of today, the anxieties of tomorrow, slip from your mind like water through open fingers. And let us walk together, step by step, breath by breath, through the streets of ancient Athens. You are standing in the agora just as the first light touches the hilltops. This is not the hour of business yet. This is the liminal time, the threshold between night and day, when the city is suspended between sleeping and waking, when the boundary between the mortal world and the realm of dreams is at its thinnest. The air is still and quiet, almost holy in its silence, broken only by the distant murmur of voices from the harbor where fishermen are already at work, and the occasional bleat of a goat being led to market by a slave or a farmer from the countryside. Around you, the city is beginning to stir, slowly, incrementally, like a great beast rousing itself from slumber. Shopkeepers are beginning to emerge from their homes, yawning, stretching their arms to the sky, preparing for another day of commerce. You can see them unrolling their awnings, simple pieces of woven fabric that will provide precious shade when the sun climbs high and beats down mercilessly on the square. Slaves are moving through the streets like shadows, carrying large clay water jars, amphorae, from the public fountains. The fountains are gathering places, social hubs where women and slaves come to collect the water needed for cooking, for cleaning, for drinking, for washing. The sound of water splashing into pottery echoes off the whitewashed walls, a liquid music that marks the rhythm of daily life. The smell of baking bread drifts from a nearby oven, warm and yeasty and comforting, mingling with the earthy scent of dust and donkey dung that is ground into every street, every alleyway, every corner of the city. A rooster crows from somewhere deep in the maze of houses, announcing the arrival of day. A dog barks in response. Life is returning to Athens. This open square before you, the agora, is the beating heart of the city, the place where all the arteries of Athenian life converge and pulse. It is not grand in the way a palace or a temple is grand, not in the way that later empires will build their forums and their public squares with marble colonnades and triumphal arches. It is functional, worn smooth by use, alive with the accumulated presence of generations who have walked here, argued here, bought and sold and lived and died here. The ground beneath your sandaled feet is hard-packed earth, compressed by the passage of countless feet over countless years, uneven and grooved by the wheels of the carts that have crossed it decade after decade, century after century. In some places, particularly near the more important buildings, the ground is paved with rough stones fitted together without mortar, but mostly it is simply dirt, dusty and pale in the long dry summers, muddy and treacherous in the brief rainy winters. Around the edges of the square, simple stores provide shade and shelter from sun and rain. These are long covered porches with columns, open on one side to the square, enclosed on the other with walls pierced by doorways leading to shops and offices and meeting rooms. The columns are simple, Doric, without elaborate capitals or decoration. The roofs are tiled with red terracotta. Beneath these roofs, out of the direct light, you can see men beginning to gather. Some are merchants setting up their wares on simple wooden tables or on lengths of cloth spread on the ground, olives in wooden bowls, fish laid out on beds of seaweed, clay pots and bronze jewelry and leather sandals. Others are citizens, men draped in simple woolen cloaks called himatians, lengths of fabric wrapped around the body and over one shoulder, leaving the right arm free. They have come not to buy or sell but to talk, to argue, to listen, to gossip, to engage in the endless conversation that is the lifeblood of the polis, the city-state. The buildings that line the agora are modest compared to the grandeur you might expect from a city of such enduring fame. Most are built of sun-dried brick, mud mixed with straw and left to bake in the sun until hard, then plastered over with lime to protect them from the weather and to reflect the harsh summer heat. The roofs are red tile, baked in kilns outside the city walls and carried in on donkeys. There are no vast stone facades here in this part of the city, no towering columns supporting elaborate pediments carved with scenes of gods and heroes. The architecture is practical, utilitarian, designed for use rather than spectacle, though there is a quiet dignity to it all, a sense of proportion and balance that is distinctly and recognizably Greek, that will influence architecture for the next 2,500 years. You notice a row of small workshops built into the base of one of the stoves. A blacksmith's forge glows faintly in the shadows, the coals still low but beginning to heat. Soon they will be white hot and ready for work. Soon the sharp ring of hammer on anvil will fill the air, a rhythmic metallic percussion that will continue throughout the day as the smith shapes iron into tools and weapons. Next to the smithy, a potter is already at his wheel, his hands slick with wet red clay, shaping a vessel with practiced ease. His movements so fluid and automatic they seem almost unconscious. His foot pumps a wooden treadle that spins the wheel. You can see the intense concentration in his weathered face, the way his hands move almost independently of his conscious thought, guided by muscle memory built over decades of daily repetition. Further along, a shoemaker sits cross-legged on a low wooden stool outside his shop, stitching leather with a curved bone needle, pulling the waxed linen thread tight, his movements economical and precise, wasting no motion, no material. These men, the craftsmen and the shopkeepers who line the agora, are not citizens in the full sense of the word, not members of the exclusive club that controls the political life of Athens. Many of them, perhaps most, are metics, metoikoi, foreign-born residents who have come to Athens from other Greek cities, or from the wider Mediterranean world. They are from the islands of the Aegean, from Ionia on the coast of Asia Minor, from the Greek colonies in southern Italy and Sicily, from Thrace and Macedon in the north. They have been drawn here by opportunity, by the wealth and the energy and the possibilities that Athens offers. They pay a special tax, the metoikoi, for the privilege of living and working in the city. They are required to register with a citizen sponsor. They serve in the army when called, standing in the phalanx alongside citizens, risking their lives for a city that will never fully accept them. They contribute to the economy, to the culture, to the daily life of Athens in countless ways, both large and small. But they will never vote in the assembly. They will never hold political office, never serve as archons or strategoi, never sit in judgment on the law courts. They will never be full members of the polis, no matter how long they live here, no matter how successful they become, no matter how much they give to the city. This is a society built on careful distinctions, on layers of inclusion and exclusion that define every aspect of life, that determine who has a voice and who must remain silent. Citizenship is not a right that can be earned or purchased. It is a privilege, inherited through blood, through ancestry, guarded jealously, rarely granted to outsiders. To be Athenian is to be part of a closed community, bound by ties of kinship and shared history and common sacrifice that go back generations. As the sun climbs higher, spreading its golden light across the rooftops and down into the narrow streets and alleyways, the agora begins to fill with people and noise and movement. The quiet of dawn gives way to the bustle of commerce and conversation. The noise grows, a rising tide of human voices, a symphony of activity, Voices overlap and interweave in a dozen different dialects of Greek, each with its own distinctive music and rhythm. There is Ionic from the eastern islands, soft and melodious. There is Doric from the Peloponnese and the western colonies, harsh and clipped. There is Attic from Athens itself, the prestige dialect, the language of literature and philosophy. A fishmonger has set up his simple stall near the edge of the square, his catch of the morning laid out carefully on a bed of fresh seaweed, the fish still glistening with seawater, their scales catching the light like mirrors. He calls out his prices in a loud, practiced voice honed by years of hawking his wares, trying to catch the attention of passers-by, competing with all the other voices clamoring for attention. A farmer from the countryside is haggling over the price of olives with a potential customer, their voices rising and falling in the age-old ritual dance of negotiation, each trying to get the better deal, each enjoying the game as much as the outcome. A group of young men, their bodies lean and muscular, their skin oiled until it gleams in the early morning light, their long hair bound up in simple knots at the nape of their necks in the fashion of athletes, pass by laughing and shoving each other playfully. On their way back from the gymnasium where they have been training since before dawn, wrestling and running and throwing the discus, they carry themselves with the easy confidence of youth and health and belonging, secure in their citizenship, in their place in the world. And then you see them, standing in small groups or moving slowly through the crowd, and you recognize them immediately, even though they wear no special clothing, carry no badges of office. The philosophers, they are not set apart by any external sign. They do not wear the robes of priests or the armor of soldiers. They wear the same simple tunics and cloaks as everyone else, the same leather sandals that expose their toes to the dust. But you can recognize them by the way they move through the crowd, by the way they interact with the world around them. They do not hurry. They are not rushing to complete some task or transaction. They stop frequently to observe, to think, to question. They engage strangers in conversation, approaching people at random, interrupting their business to ask strange questions that seem to have no practical purpose. One of them, an older man perhaps in his 60s, with a snub flat nose and a stocky barrel-chested build, his face weathered and deeply lined by time and weather and thought, his beard untrimmed and going grey, is speaking to a young potter who has just finished shaping a simple drinking cup on his wheel. The philosopher is asking him about the nature of beauty, one of those abstract concepts that most people never think about consciously. How do you know when a pot is beautiful? What makes this cup beautiful, and another one ugly? Is it something about the shape, the graceful curve of the handle, the way the lip is turned? Is it the glaze, the color, the way light catches and reflects on the surface? Or is there something deeper, something beyond the physical object itself, some eternal unchanging idea of beauty that exists even before you sit down at your wheel and touch your hands to the clay, some perfect standard against which all actual pots are judged and found wanting? The young potter looks puzzled at first, caught off guard by the question, then intrigued as he begins to think about something he has always known intuitively, has felt in his hands and his eyes but never tried to put into words. Then frustrated as he discovers that he cannot articulate what he thought he knew, cannot define beauty in a way that satisfies this persistent questioner. This is Socrates, though you do not know his name yet, though he is still just another face in the crowd. And this simple exchange in a dusty marketplace between a philosopher who claims to know nothing and a craftsman who thought he understood his trade is how philosophy begins. This is the birth of critical thinking, of the examined life, of the restless questioning that will never quite be satisfied with any answer. From anywhere in the Agora, you can see the Acropolis rising to the south, dominating the city, impossible to ignore. It is a massive limestone outcrop, a natural fortress that climbs steeply and dramatically into the sky. The cliffs are sheer on three sides, dropping away almost vertically, making the summit nearly inaccessible, except by the carefully constructed pathway on the western approach. The top is a roughly flat plateau, perhaps 300 meters long and 150 meters wide, and on this sacred plateau stands the most important religious precinct of Athens, the sanctuary of Athena, the virgin warrior goddess, who is the city's patron and protector. Even from down here in the Agora, even from half a kilometer away, you can see the gleam of white marble, almost painfully bright in the morning sun, the sharp clean lines of the Parthenon, catching and reflecting the light. It is a temple dedicated to Athena Parthenos, Athena the Virgin, and it is still relatively new, completed only a few decades ago. The paint on its sculptures is fresh and vivid and unfaded. The colors, deep blue and bright red and gleaming gold, have not yet been bleached by decades of exposure to sun and wind and rain. This is not the weathered bone-white ruin that archaeologists will excavate 2,000 years in the future, stripped of all its ornament and color, reduced to bare stone. This is a building alive with color and meaning and power. The Acropolis is not just a religious site, though it is certainly that, the dwelling place of the goddess. It is a statement, a declaration, a monument to Athenian pride and ambition. It declares to the world, to every sailor who approaches the harbor from the sea, to every traveler who arrives on foot along the roads from the north or the west, that Athens is powerful, wealthy, favored by the gods, and utterly unafraid. But it is also more than a mere display. It is a treasury where the wealth of the city is stored. It is a fortress that can be held if the lower city is ever overrun. It is the physical and spiritual center of Athenian identity. To be Athenian, to truly belong to this city, is to belong to the city that built the Parthenon. You begin to walk through the streets that radiate outward from the agora like the irregular spokes of a wheel, narrow lanes that twist and turn and double back on themselves, following no rational plan, no geometrical grid, simply the accumulated decisions of generations of individual builders and property owners. The city is an organic maze, unplanned, shaped by the contours of the land and the needs and whims of its inhabitants, rather than by any master architect or city planner. The streets are narrow, often no wider than two men walking abreast with their arms outstretched, sometimes even narrower than that, forcing you to turn sideways and press yourself against a wall to let a donkey loaded with goods squeeze past. The buildings press close on either side, their upper stories sometimes jutting out and overhanging the street below, creating tunnels of deep shade that provide welcome relief from the brutal summer sun, pockets of cool shadow even in the heat of midday. The walls are whitewashed with lime, though the plaster is cracked and stained and peeling in places, flaking away to reveal the sun-dried brick beneath, the color of baked earth. Doorways are small and low, designed to be easily defended in case of trouble, forcing visitors to duck and making it difficult for armed men to force their way inside. Privacy is highly valued here, one of the most important virtues. The houses turn inward, their few small windows facing internal courtyards, rather than the public street. From the outside, from where you stand, they are anonymous, blank, almost secretive, giving nothing away, revealing nothing of the lives lived within. Inside, if you were invited to enter, which you are not, you would find a different world entirely. A courtyard open to the sky, the heart of the house, with a small altar to the household gods, perhaps a potted fig tree, or a grapevine trained along one wall, its leaves providing dappled shade. Rooms arranged around this central open space, for sleeping, for storage, for the women's quarters, where the wife and daughters and female slaves spend most of their sequestered time. But you are not invited inside these domestic spaces. You are a stranger, an outsider, and your place is in the public realm of the street and the marketplace. The streets smell of life in all its complicated and overlapping forms. There is the acrid, sharp, eye-watering tang of stale urine from the fuller's workshops, where woolen cloth is cleaned and bleached using urine collected from public latrines and allowed to age until the ammonia is strong enough to break down the oils and dirt in the fabric. There is the sweet, heavy, almost sickly scent of olive oil drifting from the lamp makers' shops, where small clay lamps with elongated spouts are being filled and sold, the oil that will light homes after dark. There is smoke everywhere, always smoke, hanging in the air, stinging your eyes, catching in your throat. From cooking fires burning in every household and from the kilns outside the city walls where pottery is fired and bricks are baked at temperatures high enough to turn clay into ceramic. And beneath it all, permeating everything, is the smell of humanity in its most basic and undeniable forms. Sweat from bodies working in the heat, waste human and animal that accumulates in the streets. Perfume made from flowers and herbs and oils worn by those who can afford such luxuries. Wine spilled and left to dry and turn sour in the sun. Athens is not a clean city in the way that we who live in the modern world with our sewers and our water treatment plants understand cleanliness. There are no underground pipes carrying waste away to some distant, unseen place. There is no running water in the houses, no flush toilets, no garbage collection. Waste is thrown into the streets from upper windows or into designated pits, or it is collected by slaves in buckets and carried outside the city walls to be dumped in ravines. Flies are everywhere, buzzing in thick clouds around the butcher's stalls where meat hangs in the open air, around the piles of refuse that accumulate in corners, around the animals that wander freely through the streets. But this is normal, unremarkable, the texture of urban life in the ancient world, and you barely notice it after a while. Your senses adapt quickly, filtering out the constant background assault of odors, focusing only on the most extreme or unusual. You become part of the sensory landscape, accustomed to its rhythms and its textures. As you move slowly through the city, walking without particular destination, simply exploring, taking in the sights and the sounds and the smells, you begin to notice the people more closely, to see them as individuals rather than as an undifferentiated mass. There are far more men visible in the streets than women, a disproportion that would be immediately obvious to any modern observer, but that seems natural and unremarkable to you in this time and place. The men you see are of all ages and conditions, young boys barely old enough to be out on their own without supervision, running and playing and getting underfoot. Adolescents in groups, loud and boisterous, testing their growing strength and confidence. Men in the prime of life, moving through the streets with purpose, on their way to the agora or the gymnasium or the harbor, to conduct business or to meet friends. Old men bent with age, leaning on walking sticks, their skin deeply lined and sun-darkened, their movements slow and careful. They move through the public spaces with easy familiarity, stopping frequently to talk to each other, forming small knots of conversation that block the narrow lanes and force others to squeeze past or wait patiently for them to finish. The women you do see in the streets are mostly either slaves, easily identifiable by their rough homespun clothing and their burdens, carrying water jars balanced on their heads or shoulders, or bundles of firewood, or baskets of vegetables, running errands for their masters and mistresses, or they are older women, women past the age of childbearing and therefore past the age of strict seclusion, women who are too old to be objects of desire or concern, and who have therefore earned a degree of freedom to move more openly in public. Respectable women of childbearing age, the wives and daughters of citizens, remain almost entirely invisible during the daylight hours. They spend their time in the gynekonitis, the women's quarters, usually located in the back of the house or on the upper floor, as far as possible from the street, and from the andron, the men's quarters where male guests are received. Here they spin raw wool into thread using simple drop spindles, weave cloth on vertical looms, manage the household slaves, supervise the preparation of food, raise small children, and prepare daughters for their future roles as wives. They do not attend the assembly where laws are debated and voted on. They do not go to the gymnasium to exercise or to listen to lectures. They do not attend the theater except on certain special festival days, and even then their presence is restricted to separate sections, carefully segregated from the men. This is a world built by men, for men, organized around male concerns and male definitions of what matters, and the freedoms that Athens celebrates so loudly, the democracy and the equality that are the city's pride, are not extended to half its population. You pass a small group of slaves, 3 or 4 men dressed in rough undyed tunics that come to mid-thigh, their feet bare and calloused, leading a donkey that is loaded down with large amphorae, the pointed-bottomed clay jars used for storing and transporting oil and wine and grain and fish sauce and all manner of commodities. The amphorae are heavy, 50 or 60 pounds each when full, and the donkey walks slowly under the weight, its head down, its steps deliberate. The slaves speak to each other in low voices, in a language you do not recognize, something from the edges of the Greek world or beyond, perhaps Thracian or Scythian or Phrygian. Their skin is darker than that of most Greeks, marked by sun and by heritage, their hair cropped short. Slavery is the foundation of Athenian life, the hidden structure on which the entire edifice of democracy and culture and leisure rests. It is not questioned by anyone, not challenged, not debated in the assembly or discussed in the law courts or examined by the philosophers, despite all their questioning of other things. It simply is, as natural and inevitable and unremarkable as the rising of the sun or the changing of the seasons. Slaves come from all over the known world and from beyond its edges. Some are prisoners of war, captured in battle and sold in the slave markets that exist in every major city. Some are born into slavery, the children of slave mothers, inheriting their condition like eye color or height. Some are foreigners kidnapped by raiders or pirates and sold to traders who prowl the edges of the Greek world looking for human merchandise. They work in the silver mines deep beneath the earth at Laurium to the south, where the veins of precious metal that fund Athenian power are extracted at terrible human cost, where men labor in darkness and breathe in poisonous dust and fumes, where life expectancy is measured in months rather than years. They work in the fields outside the city walls, planting barley and wheat, tending olive groves, harvesting grapes, doing the back-breaking agricultural labor that feeds the city. They work as domestic servants in the houses of the wealthy and the not-so-wealthy, cooking meals, cleaning, fetching water, emptying chamber pots, tending to children, managing the complex operations of a household. They serve as tutors, pedagogoi to the sons of wealthy families, teaching them to read and write and calculate, accompanying them to and from school, supervising their behavior. They row the warships that patrol the Aegean and defend the city from its enemies, their backs bent to the oars hour after hour, their hands blistered and bleeding, pulling in unison to drive the sleek triremes through the water. Without slaves, the entire structure of Athenian society would collapse like a building whose foundation has been removed. The citizens would have to work with their hands, would have to spend their days not in the agora debating philosophy, or in the assembly making laws, or in the gymnasium perfecting their bodies and minds, but rather in the fields and the workshops and the mines, laboring simply to survive. And yet, in the philosophy that is being born in these very streets and squares, in the passionate debates about justice and virtue, and the nature of the good life, about what makes a society just and what gives some men the right to rule over others, slavery is rarely mentioned and almost never criticized. It is invisible to these great thinkers, taken entirely for granted, a massive blind spot at the very heart of the city's proud claim to enlightenment and freedom. Now imagine that the sun is higher, approaching its zenith, and you make your way southwest toward the coast, descending gradually from the hills on which Athens sits toward the flat coastal plain and the sea beyond. The road to Piraeus is well traveled, wide enough for two carts to pass each other, packed hard by the constant traffic. Piraeus is the port of Athens, a separate settlement 5 or 6 kilometers from the main city, and it is connected to Athens by one of the most remarkable defensive works in the ancient world, the Long Walls. These are two massive parallel fortifications, each stretching for miles, built of stone blocks fitted together without mortar, rising 6 or 7 meters high, thick enough that 2 chariots could pass each other on top if chariots were driven on walls, which they are not. The walls enclose a corridor of land between Athens and the sea, creating a protected lifeline. As long as these walls stand intact, as long as they are properly garrisoned and maintained, Athens cannot be starved into submission by any land-based enemy. The city is protected, supplied by the ships that dock at Piraeus, theoretically invincible, or so the Athenians believe, and so it will prove for many years until finally Sparta finds a way to cut the sea lanes themselves. The road between the long walls is busy at every hour of the day and night. Heavy carts creak slowly past, their solid wooden wheels groaning under the weight of goods being transported to or from the harbor, leaving deep ruts in the packed earth. Merchants walk in groups for safety, discussing prices and trade routes and profit margins, calculating in their heads the complex mathematics of commerce. Sailors and oarsmen, men whose lives are spent on the water, stride with the distinctive rolling gait of those whose bodies have adapted to the constant motion of a ship's deck, their skin darkened to deep bronze by the sun, their hair bleached nearly white by salt spray and sun. The smell of the sea grows steadily stronger as you approach the coast, that distinctive and unmistakable scent that is salt and fish and seaweed, and something else, something indefinable but universally recognized, the smell of vastness and possibility and danger. You can taste it on your tongue, sharp and clean, and somehow alive, and then you crest a low rise and you see it spread out before you like a vision from a dream, and even though you have heard it described, even though you thought you knew what to expect, the reality takes your breath away. The harbor of Piraeus, a forest of masts rising from the water like the trees of some strange aquatic grove, hundreds upon hundreds of them, swaying gently with the motion of the tide and the breeze. Ships of every conceivable kind, from small single-sailed fishing boats worked by a family or a partnership to massive broad-beamed merchant vessels with deep holds capable of carrying hundreds of tons of cargo, are tied up at wooden docks that project out into the water or anchored in the deeper water farther from shore. The harbor is shaped like a natural amphitheater, a gift of geography, protected on three sides by land that shelters it from the worst storms, open to the south where the Aegean stretches away to the horizon in an endless expanse of blue. There are actually three separate harbors here at Piraeus, each serving a different purpose in the complex maritime economy that keeps Athens alive. The largest harbor, Kantharos, is for commercial shipping, where the merchant vessels load and unload their cargoes. Another, Zae, is primarily for warships, and there in a third harbor called Munichia, kept separate and distinct, sleek and menacing, even at rest like predatory animals waiting patiently for prey, are the triremes, the warships that have made Athens the dominant naval power in the Greek world. These triremes are engineering marvels, the product of decades of refinement and improvement, representing the cutting edge of naval technology. They are built for speed and maneuverability above all else, not for carrying capacity or comfort or any other consideration. Each one is powered by 170 oarsmen, arranged in 3 tiers on each side, 3 banks of oars, which gives the vessel its name triremes, 3 oars. The oarsmen sit one above another on outriggers, pulling oars of different lengths, the whole complex mechanism coordinated by the rhythmic chant of a pipe player, working in perfect unison to drive the ship forward at speeds no other vessel can match. The hull is long and narrow and shallow drafted, designed to slice through the water with minimal resistance, built of pine and fir from the forests of Macedon and Thrace, every plank and joint carefully fitted and sealed with pitch. At the prow, mounted just below the waterline, invisible until the moment of impact, is the ram, a massive bronze beak weighing several hundred pounds, pointed and reinforced, designed for one purpose only: to punch through the wooden hull of an enemy ship below the waterline, to splinter the planks and let the sea pour in to sink her. The triremes are not impressive for their size, they are actually relatively small and light, fragile even, built for speed rather than strength, but they are fast, incredibly fast, capable of covering miles in an hour when conditions are right and the crew is experienced. They are maneuverable, able to turn in their own length almost, to dart in and attack and withdraw before a slower enemy can respond. They are machines, precision instruments of naval warfare, and like all complex machines they require constant maintenance and care. The wood must be constantly inspected for rot and decay and infestation by shipworms that bore through the planks. The ropes must be tarred regularly to protect them from the corrosive effects of sea water. The 170 oars, each one individually crafted and balanced, must be counted and stored in special sheds when not in use to prevent them from warping or being stolen. The bronze ram must be kept polished and its edge kept sharp. The Athenian navy is a triumph of organization and logistics and discipline, of careful planning and rigorous training. It is also the fundamental reason that Athens can project power across the Aegean, can control the trade routes that bring grain from the Black Sea, can demand tribute from subject cities and enforce that demand, can defeat the mighty Persian Empire at sea, can dominate its rivals and build an empire. But Piraeus is not just about war, not just about military power and the projection of force. It is equally, perhaps more fundamentally, about trade, about commerce, about the peaceful movement of goods that keeps the city alive and prosperous. Goods flow in and out of these harbors every day in an endless stream, a constant circulation that links Athens to every corner of the Mediterranean world and beyond. Grain comes from the north, from the fertile black earth plains north of the Black Sea in the kingdoms of the Scythians and the Bosporan kingdom, loaded into the holds of broad-beamed merchant ships and carried hundreds of miles across often dangerous waters. This grain is absolutely essential, a matter of life and death. Without it, Athens would starve. The rocky soil of Attica, the region immediately surrounding Athens, produces olives and grapes in abundance, but it cannot produce enough wheat and barley to feed a city of tens of thousands. So Athens imports grain, vast quantities of it, and pays for those imports with the silver from its mines at Laurium, with the manufactured goods produced in its workshops, with the tribute extracted from its empire. Wine comes to Piraeus from the islands, from Chios and Lesbos and Thassos and Rhodes, each region producing its own distinctive varieties, stored in amphorae stamped with the seals of the producers to prevent fraud, a primitive form of branding and quality control. Timber comes from the north, from the forests of Thrace and Macedon, long straight logs of pine and oak and fir that will be shaped by the shipwrights into the hulls and the oars and the masts of the fleet, without which the navy could not exist. Purple dye comes from the Phoenician cities of the Levant, Tyre and Sidon, extracted at enormous labor from tiny murex sea snails, thousands of them crushed to produce a few drops of dye, so rare and so expensive that garments dyed with it become status symbols, marks of wealth and power. Papyrus comes from Egypt, from the Nile Delta where the papyrus plant grows in the marshes, providing the writing material that makes literature and philosophy and record-keeping possible, without which the written culture of Greece could not exist. Ivory and gold and exotic animals come from Africa, from beyond the edges of the Greek world, carried by traders through deserts and across seas, following routes that have existed since time immemorial. The economy of Athens depends utterly on this trade, on the ships and the sailors and the merchants and the harbor workers, on the complex networks of credit and exchange that span the Mediterranean like an invisible web. The harbor is loud, almost overwhelmingly so, a cacophony of human activity and commerce. The air is filled with voices shouting in a dozen languages, arguing, laughing, cursing, calling out prices and quantities. You hear Phoenician spoken by the purple traders from Tyre, Egyptian from the papyrus merchants, Thracian from the timber dealers, Ionian and Doric and Attic Greek in all their varieties. This is the most cosmopolitan place in Athens, a crossroads where people from every corner of the known world come together to exchange goods and information and ideas. Dockworkers, muscular men stripped to loincloths, despite the morning chill, are loading and unloading cargo, carrying heavy sacks of grain on their shoulders, rolling amphorae of wine and oil along wooden gangplanks, their backs bent under the weight, their bodies glistening with sweat, despite the early hour. Merchants are everywhere, inspecting goods with practiced eyes, checking for quality and quantity, haggling fiercely over prices, calculating profit margins in their heads or scratching figures on wax tablets. Ship captains are moving from vessel to vessel, shouting orders to crews, hiring additional oarsmen for voyages, consulting with harbor officials about winds and weather and the safety of routes. Slaves are everywhere, performing all the hard physical labor that makes this vast commercial operation function, carrying and lifting and loading and dragging. The smell here is intense, overwhelming, a complex mixture of tar used to seal hulls and preserve ropes, of seaweed rotting on the shore, of fish both fresh and not so fresh, of human sweat, of sewage from the ships and from the warehouses, of salt and sun-baked wood and canvas. And everywhere, underlying everything, is the constant sound of water lapping against the hulls of ships, slapping against the wooden pilings of the docks, providing a rhythmic background to the human noise. It is here, standing on these docks, surrounded by this chaos and commerce, that you truly begin to understand what Athens is, what makes it different from other Greek cities. Athens is not just a city in the traditional sense, not simply a settlement of people living in one place, supporting themselves through local agriculture and crafts. It is a hub, a nexus, a node in a vast network of exchange that spans the entire Mediterranean and beyond. It is a system, complex and dynamic, that draws resources and people and ideas from everywhere and sends its own influence outward in return. Athens is a trading empire disguised as a city-state, a naval power that controls sea lanes and extracts tribute, a cultural center that exports its language and its ideas along with its pottery and its olive oil. Everything is connected, everything depends on everything else in ways that are not immediately visible, but that determine the shape and the fate of the city. The democracy depends fundamentally on the navy, not just for defense, but because the navy is crewed primarily by the poorest citizens, the thets who own no land and cannot afford the armor of a hoplite. Men who row the ships and who therefore, by their service and their sacrifice, earn the right to a voice in government, to a vote in the assembly. The philosophy and the art and the theater depend on the wealth generated by trade and by the empire, because philosophy requires leisure, requires men who do not have to spend every waking hour laboring to survive, requires a class of people who have the time and the education to think and to question. The great building projects, the Parthenon, and the other temples, depend on the tribute extracted from subject cities, on the wealth that flows into Athens from across the empire. Everything is interconnected, interdependent, fragile in ways that are not always apparent. As the day wears on and the sun begins its slow descent toward the western horizon, you make your way back to the city, walking once more between the long walls. By now, late afternoon, the agora is at its busiest and most crowded. The philosophers are still there, still moving through the crowd, still asking their strange and provocative questions, still engaging anyone who will listen. But alongside the philosophical conversations, the real business of the day is beginning, the serious and consequential business of politics. Men are gathering in small tight groups, their heads close together, their voices low and serious and intense, their faces showing the concentration and concern that political matters demand. They are discussing the issues of the moment, the questions that will be debated and voted on in the upcoming session of the Assembly. Who will speak? What arguments will be made? What laws are being proposed? What is the latest news from Sparta, that rival city in the Peloponnese that grows stronger and more threatening every year? Should Athens take preemptive action, strike first before Sparta can gather its allies? What about the tribute from the subject cities? Has it all been collected, or are there cities in arrears, cities that need to be reminded of their obligations? Who should be ostracized this year, removed from the city for 10 years because their influence has grown too great, because they threaten the balance of power? The political life of Athens is intense, all-consuming, impossible to avoid or ignore. If you are a citizen, and only if you are a citizen, you are expected to participate actively and regularly. This is not a representative democracy in the modern sense, not a system where you elect a few officials every few years to govern on your behalf while you go about your private life undisturbed. You are the government. You, personally, along with every other citizen, vote directly on the laws, every law, every decree, every significant policy decision. You serve on juries, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, deciding cases that range from trivial disputes between neighbors to capital offenses punishable by death. You might be chosen by lot, by random selection, to serve in the Council of 500, the bulla, the body that prepares legislation for the Assembly, that sets the agenda, that manages the day-to-day administrative operations of government. This is direct democracy in its purest and most demanding form, and it is both exhilarating and exhausting, liberating and burdensome, empowering and overwhelming. The Assembly, the Ecclesia, meets on the Pnyx, a low hill to the west of the Acropolis, within the city walls, but separate from the bustle and noise of the Agora. It is a natural amphitheater, a gift of geography, with a sloping hillside that has been cut and shaped and terraced over the years to provide better accommodation for the thousands who gather here. The hillside faces north, so that the speakers on the bema, the raised stone platform at the bottom, are looking up at the assembled citizens with the Acropolis rising dramatically behind them, a constant reminder of why they are here, what they are defending. Most men simply sit on the bare ground or bring cushions or folded cloaks to make themselves more comfortable for what can be very long meetings. When the Assembly is in session, when important matters are to be decided, a quorum of 6,000 citizens is required. 6,000 men, out of a total citizen body of perhaps 40,000, gathered in one place to debate and vote on the issues of the day. The meetings begin at dawn, announced by a blast from a trumpet, and they can last for many hours, sometimes stretching into the afternoon, as speaker after speaker mounts the bema to have his say. There is no formal agenda beyond what the council has prepared and posted in advance. Any citizen, anyone at all, has the right to stand up and propose a law, has the right to address the Assembly, to make his case before thousands of his peers. Any citizen can speak in debate, can argue for or against a proposal, can challenge the logic or the morality or the practicality of what is being suggested. In practice, of course, as in any large gathering, some voices carry more weight than others. Men of wealth and established reputation, men who have proven themselves as capable orators, men who have military victories to their credit and who can speak from experience, are more likely to be heard attentively, more likely to persuade, more likely to sway the vote. But the principle, the radical and unprecedented principle that underlies the entire system, is that ordinary men, farmers who work their own small plots of land and craftsmen who work with their hands and shopkeepers who buy and sell, should have an equal voice in how they are governed, should participate directly in making the laws that bind them, should be citizens in the fullest and most demanding sense of the word. This is almost unheard of in the ancient world, where almost all societies are ruled by kings or by narrow aristocracies, where power is inherited by birth rather than shared among the people, where the common man has no voice except to obey. The voting in the assembly is done by show of hands, a simple and direct method. No secret ballots, no privacy, no anonymity. You raise your hand, your right hand, for all to see, declaring your position publicly, letting your neighbors and your fellow citizens know where you stand. The presiding officers, the prytanes, men who have been chosen by lot from among the members of the council to serve for a limited time, make a rough count, estimating by eye the numbers on each side, and the majority wins. It is crude by modern standards, imprecise, open to errors of counting, but it is effective, and it is transparent. Laws are passed or rejected. Treaties with other cities are ratified or repudiated. Generals, the strategoi, are appointed to lead the army and the navy, or they are removed from command if they have failed. And sometimes, perhaps once a year, in a procedure that is uniquely Athenian and that reveals something deep about how the democracy understands itself, men are ostracized. This is one of the strangest and most telling features of the entire system, a safety valve designed to protect the democracy from its own potential weaknesses. Once a year, usually in midwinter, the assembly votes on a simple question: should an ostracism be held this year? If a majority votes yes, if the citizens collectively feel that there is a danger, that someone has become too powerful or too influential, that the balance that keeps the democracy healthy is threatened, then a special session is scheduled several weeks later. On the appointed day, each citizen writes a name on a piece of broken pottery, an ostracon. Pottery shards are everywhere in Athens, common as dirt, essentially free, and they serve as readily available writing surfaces for those who can write and who can pay a scribe if they cannot. The name written on the ostracon is the name of the man the citizen believes is a threat to the democracy, the man he wants removed. The ostracon are collected in baskets and carefully counted by officials, and if there are at least 6,000 votes cast in total, the man whose name appears most frequently is exiled from Athens for 10 years. He loses no property, his estates are not confiscated, his family is not punished. He is not charged with any crime, not put on trial, not given a formal opportunity to defend himself. He simply must leave the city within 10 days and not return for a decade. The stated purpose of ostracism is to prevent any one individual from becoming too powerful, from accumulating too much influence and wealth and followers, from becoming a potential tyrant who could overthrow the democracy and establish one-man rule. It is democracy protecting itself from the threat of tyranny, from the danger that some ambitious man might use his gifts of eloquence, or his military successes, or his vast wealth to subvert the system from within. But ostracism is also a weapon that can be used for less noble and less pure purposes. It can be used to remove political rivals simply because they are rivals, to settle old personal grudges that have nothing to do with threats to democracy, to punish men for unpopular opinions, or for being too outspoken, or for being foreign-born, or simply for being successful and therefore envied. The system is brilliant and dangerous in equal measure, a tool that can preserve democracy or pervert it, depending on who wields it and for what ends. Imagine now that you are sitting on the hard ground of the Pnyx on a clear spring morning, surrounded by thousands of men, citizens all, your social equals at least in theory. The sun is already hot on your shoulders, even though it is still morning, and the hillside is dusty and dry and uncomfortable. A speaker has just finished a long and passionate argument in favor of taking aggressive action against Sparta, of striking first before Sparta and its allies can fully mobilize, of using Athens' undisputed naval superiority to blockade the Peloponnese and starve the Spartans into submission, or at least into a more favorable negotiating position. His voice has been rising steadily as he speaks, his gestures growing more dramatic and sweeping, and the crowd has responded enthusiastically with shouts of approval and encouragement, many men stamping their feet or banging their staffs on the ground in support. The emotional temperature of the assembly is high, the mood belligerent and confident, but now another man rises to respond. He is older than the first speaker, grayer, his face more lined, his movements slower and more deliberate. He walks calmly to the bema, the speaker's platform, and stands there for a long moment in complete silence, letting the crowd settle, letting the excitement of the previous speech fade, allowing a space for a different kind of rhetoric. Then he begins to speak, and his voice is measured, controlled, almost quiet, forcing people to lean forward and listen carefully. He warns of the costs of war, costs that are easy to ignore when war is still an abstraction, but that become all too real once blood begins to flow. He speaks of the lives that will be lost, fathers and sons and brothers who will not come home, families that will be left without providers, children who will grow up without fathers. He speaks of the wealth that will be consumed, the silver that will be drained from the treasury to build ships and buy supplies and pay rowers and soldiers. He speaks of the danger of provoking Sparta's formidable land army, the best heavy infantry in the Greek world, an army that has never been defeated in a pitched battle in living memory. He reminds the assembly of the plague that struck Athens a generation ago, of how a confident city at the height of its power was brought to its knees by an invisible enemy that no one understood and no one could fight, of how quickly confidence can turn to catastrophe, how rapidly fortunes can reverse. He urges caution, patience, diplomacy, continued negotiation. He suggests that perhaps the best course of action is to do nothing precipitate, to wait and to watch and to prepare but not to strike the first blow. The crowd's response is divided, uncertain. Some men nod their heads in agreement, tapping their walking staffs on the ground in approval of this more measured approach. Others jeer and call out, accusing the speaker of cowardice, suggesting that he must be secretly in Sparta's pay, that he is betraying Athens. The noise grows, becomes a roar, voices overlapping and shouting until individual words are lost in the general cacophony. And you realize, sitting there in the dust and the heat and the noise, that this is not a calm and rational debate conducted according to strict rules of logic and evidence and civil discourse. This is democracy as it actually exists and functions, in all its messy, emotional, unpredictable, deeply human reality. It is loud and chaotic and passionate. It is swayed by eloquence and by emotion as much as by reason. It can be manipulated by skilled speakers who know how to play on fears and prejudices. It can make terrible decisions driven by anger or pride or fear. And yet, for all its obvious flaws and all the ways it falls short of some ideal of perfect rationality, it works. Decisions are made, laws are passed, the city is governed, administered, defended, and the power, however imperfectly exercised, rests with the people rather than with a king or an emperor or a narrow, hereditary aristocracy. But who exactly are the people? That question is absolutely central, crucial, to understanding Athens and its democracy. The word citizen, polites in Greek, does not mean what it means in modern democratic states. The boundaries of citizenship in Athens are narrow, carefully policed, jealously guarded. To be a citizen of Athens, you must first and most obviously be male. Women, who make up half the population, are not citizens and can never be citizens. They cannot vote, cannot speak in the assembly, cannot serve on juries, cannot hold any public office, cannot own property in their own names, cannot act as legal persons. They are perpetually under the guardianship of a male relative, father or husband or brother or son. You must be born of Athenian parents, both father and mother, not just one or the other. A law passed in the mid-5th century by Pericles himself, ironically one of the greatest champions of democracy, tightened this requirement substantially, restricting citizenship to those whose parents were both Athenians by birth. Before this law, being the son of an Athenian father was sufficient, but no longer. You must be free, not a slave, not even a former slave who has been manumitted. The taint of slavery is permanent and disqualifying. You must have completed your military training, your ephebia, the 2-year period of service that transforms a boy into a man, teaching him to fight in the phalanx with spear and shield, to row a trireme, to endure hardship, to obey orders, to be part of something larger than himself. This combination of requirements excludes the vast majority of the people who live in Athens and its surrounding territory. Women, as already noted, are excluded entirely. Slaves, who may number as many as the citizens or even more, are excluded. Foreigners, the metics, even those who have lived in Athens for generations, who speak Greek as their native language, who worship the same gods, who fight in the same wars, who pay taxes and contribute to the economy, are excluded. Even the children of mixed marriages, where one parent is Athenian and the other is not, are excluded, cannot be citizens, no matter what their other qualifications. The democracy that Athens is so proud of, that it defends so fiercely, that it believes makes it morally and politically superior to other Greek cities and to the Persian Empire, is a democracy for a small fraction of the population. It is exclusive, not inclusive, narrow rather than broad, closed rather than open, and this exclusion is not an accidental oversight that might be corrected by reform, not an unfortunate temporary condition that will improve over time. It is fundamental, structural, intentional, part of how Athenians understand citizenship and democracy. Citizenship is a privilege, something precious and rare, something to be carefully guarded and preserved, not something to be carelessly distributed or easily obtained. It is inherited through blood, through membership in a family that can trace its Athenian ancestry back for generations. It cannot be earned through merit or purchased with wealth or granted as a reward for service, except in the rarest and most extraordinary circumstances. To be Athenian is to belong to an exclusive club, and the walls around that club are high and thick and jealously maintained. Now let us step away entirely from the political realm, from the assembly and the debates and the votes, and enter a different world, a world that is just as important to understanding Athens, but that exists in the shadows, largely invisible in the historical record. It is late afternoon, and you are walking toward the outskirts of the city, following a dusty road that leads to one of the gymnasia. These are large open complexes, usually located just outside the city walls or on the edges of the urban area where land is cheaper and more plentiful, where there is space for athletic fields and running tracks and the various facilities needed for training. The gymnasium is far more than a place for physical exercise, though it is certainly that. It is a social space, a place of education both physical and intellectual, a site where young men, the future citizens of Athens, are shaped and molded, where they learn what it means to be Athenian, where the Greek ideal of kalos kagathos, beautiful and good, the complete human being who is sound in both body and mind, is actively pursued and cultivated. The very word gymnasium comes from the Greek gymnos, meaning naked, unclothed, because men and boys exercise here without clothing of any kind. This nakedness is not shameful or scandalous or erotic in the way a modern person might assume. It is normal, expected, completely unremarkable. The body, far from being something to be hidden or despised or treated with suspicion, is something to be admired and celebrated and displayed and perfected. Physical beauty, muscular development, athletic prowess, these are all marks of virtue, of arete, that fundamental and untranslatable Greek concept that encompasses excellence in all its forms, moral and intellectual and physical, all at once. You enter through a colonnaded courtyard, passing through a portico into a large open area surrounded on all sides by covered walkways. The central space is flooded with brilliant sunlight, and the floor is covered with fine sand, brought up from the beaches by cartload, spread evenly across the ground. This is the palestra, the wrestling ground, and it is here that young men practice the combative sports that are so central to Greek athletic culture. Wrestling, boxing, the pankration, which is a brutal combination of both with almost no rules except for prohibitions against biting and gouging eyes. You can see perhaps a dozen pairs of young men grappling with each other, their nude bodies slick and gleaming with olive oil that has been generously poured over their skin and then dusted with fine sand to provide grip and to prevent the oil from making them too slippery to hold. The oil serves multiple purposes. It keeps the skin from being abraded by the coarse sand and by the rough holds of opponents, and it is also believed to nourish and beautify the skin, to make it smooth and supple. The sand sticks to the oiled skin, coating their bodies in a thin layer that makes them look almost like statues, like bronze sculptures come to life. Their muscles strain and bulge under the effort, clearly visible through the oil and sand. Their breath comes in sharp, controlled bursts, taught by their trainers, breath control being as important as strength or technique. A trainer stands at the edge of the wrestling ground, watching with a critical expert eye, occasionally calling out advice or correction, praising a good throw or a clever escape. The trainer is usually a former athlete himself, someone who competed successfully in his youth at the great Panhellenic Games at Olympia or Delphi or Nemea, someone who now passes his hard-won knowledge and experience to the next generation. He carries a long wooden staff, not as a weapon but as a teaching aid which he uses to demonstrate proper stances and techniques, and occasionally, when a student is not paying sufficient attention or is not putting in adequate effort, he uses it to deliver a sharp rap to the shins or the shoulders as a reminder and a correction. Beyond the open courtyard is the Existos, a long colonnaded hall, a covered space where athletes can train when the weather outside is too hot or too rainy or too cold. The Athenian climate is generally mild, but there are days when shade is needed, and the Existos provides that protection. Off the main hallway are numerous smaller rooms serving various specialized functions. There are podateria, changing rooms where men leave their clothing and belongings when they arrive, hanging their himation on pegs driven into the walls, storing their sandals in niches. There is a room with stone benches where athletes can sit and rest between bouts of training, where they can socialize and talk and form the bonds of friendship that will last throughout their lives. There is an Athesian, an oil room where large pithos storage jars filled with olive oil are kept, and where slaves whose job it is to apply the oil to the athletes' bodies before training work throughout the day. There is a Canisterian, a dusting room where fine sand is stored and where the sand is applied over the oil. There is a storage room for equipment, stacked with javelins of various weights and lengths, stone and bronze discuses polished smooth, lead jumping weights that athletes carry to give them momentum when leaping. The walls throughout the gymnasium complex are decorated with painted scenes of athletic competition, images that serve both decorative and instructional purposes. You can see discus throwers captured at the precise moment of release, their bodies coiled like springs and then extending, demonstrating perfect form. Runners frozen in full stride, their legs pumping, their arms swinging in rhythm, their faces showing intense concentration. Wrestlers locked together in combat, each seeking the hold or the throw that will bring victory and demonstrate superior technique and strength. These images are not merely decorative, they are exemplars, models, reminders of the ideals that the gymnasium exists to instill and perpetuate. They show what the young men training here should aspire to become: discipline, strength, speed, endurance, courage under pressure, self-control, grace, beauty. The athlete, in Greek culture, is not simply someone who is good at sports. He is a moral exemplar, a model citizen, someone whose physical perfection reflects and creates inner virtue. But the education that takes place within the walls of the gymnasium is not exclusively or even primarily physical. In the deep shade of a stoa, far from the heat and exertion and dust of the palestra, you can see older men and younger students engaged in what is clearly a different kind of activity. A grammatist, a teacher of letters, is reciting lines from Homer's Iliad, and his students, boys perhaps, ranging from 7 to 14 years old, are repeating the lines after him in unison, their young voices blending together, committing the verses to memory through endless repetition, the ancient method of learning that has been used since writing itself was invented. The Iliad and the Odyssey are the absolute foundation of Greek education, the texts that every educated man knows by heart, that every citizen has absorbed from childhood. They are not merely stories, not entertainment to be enjoyed and then forgotten. They are moral instruction, lessons in what it means to be a man and a hero and a citizen. The characters in these epics, Achilles with his terrible rage and his doomed glory, Odysseus with his cunning and his endurance, Hector with his devotion to family and city, Ajax with his stubborn pride. These are models to be studied and emulated and argued about. Their actions and their words are to be pondered, their choices examined, their fates contemplated. Later in their education, after they have memorized substantial portions of Homer and have learned to read and write competently, the students will learn music, which for the Greeks means both vocal music and the playing of instruments. They will be taught to play the lyre, a beautiful stringed instrument made of tortoise shell and wood, held in the lap and plucked with a plectrum made of ivory or wood or bone. They will learn to sing, to keep proper time and rhythm, to appreciate and reproduce the complex modes and scales of Greek music. And this musical education is not considered frivolous or merely ornamental, a pleasant addition to a young man's accomplishments. Music, the Greeks firmly believe, shapes the soul in profound and lasting ways, forms character, creates or destroys virtue. The right kind of music, harmonious and measured and properly constructed according to the mathematical ratios discovered by Pythagoras, makes a man balanced and virtuous and disciplined, fit to be a citizen and a soldier. The wrong kind of music, chaotic and unrestrained and emotional, corrupts the soul, makes a man weak and unreliable and dangerous to the city. Education in Athens is not about acquiring practical skills for economic advancement or filling the mind with a large quantity of factual information. It is about formation, about shaping character, about creating men who are worthy to be citizens, who can make sound judgments, who can speak persuasively, who can defend the city in war and govern it wisely in peace, who embody the ideal of kalos kagathos. As the sun begins to dip toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the grounds of the gymnasium, the young men finish their training for the day and make their way to the baths, the lautron, simple structures attached to or near every gymnasium. The bathing facilities are basic, consisting of cold plunge pools and slightly warmer rooms heated by braziers filled with glowing charcoal. The Greeks of this period do not have the elaborate hot baths that the Romans will later develop. Those engineering marvels with multiple rooms at different temperatures and sophisticated heating systems. Greek baths are simpler, colder, more austere. The athletes use a strigil, a curved metal tool that looks something like a small sickle, to scrape the mixture of oil and sand and sweat and dust from their skin, dragging the blade across their arms and legs and torsos, cleaning themselves mechanically. Then they rinse in cold water, plunging into the pools, gasping at the shock, emerging clean and refreshed. They talk as they bathe, and as they dry themselves afterward, voices echoing in the tiled rooms, sharing gossip from the city, news about upcoming events, stories about their training, jokes and insults and friendly teasing. The bonds formed here in the shared experience of training and learning and bathing together are deep and lasting, stronger often than family ties. These are the friendships that will shape their adult lives, that will determine political alliances and business partnerships, that will provide support in times of crisis. And as the evening deepens, as the sky turns from blue to purple to the deep indigo of approaching night, some of these young men, usually those from wealthier families who have the leisure and the resources for such activities, will gather for a symposium, the quintessentially Greek institution of the drinking party. The symposium takes place in a private home, specifically in a room set aside for this purpose, the andron, the men's room, which every house of any pretension possesses. The participants, always men and never women, except for hired female entertainers who are slaves, and therefore in a different category entirely, recline on couches arranged around the edges of the room in a rough rectangle, or sometimes in a U-shape. The couches are not like modern sofas. They are more like narrow beds, and the men lie on their left sides, propped up on cushions, leaving their right hands free to eat and drink and gesture. The arrangement allows everyone to see everyone else, to participate in a single unified conversation rather than breaking into separate small groups. In the center of the room stands a large ceramic mixing bowl, the crater, often a beautiful piece of pottery, decorated with elaborate scenes painted in the red figure or black figure style. The crater is where wine is mixed with water, because the Greeks never ever drink wine undiluted. To do so would be considered barbaric, a sign of lack of self-control, something that only Thracians and Scythians and other northern barbarians do. The wine is typically mixed at a ratio of 3 or even 4 parts water to 1 part wine, sometimes even more heavily diluted, depending on the occasion and the desired level of inebriation. The mixture is ladled out into shallow 2-handled drinking cups called kylikes, which are passed around among the participants or refilled by slaves as needed. As the wine begins to flow and to work its chemical magic on the minds of the participants, loosening inhibitions and encouraging boldness, the conversation begins to flow as well, and it is the conversation, not the drinking itself, that is the real point and purpose of the symposium. This is where philosophy happens, where the love of wisdom that is the literal meaning of the word philosophia is practiced and pursued. Not in the formal sense of a professional philosopher standing at the front of a room delivering a prepared lecture to passive students who take notes and ask occasional questions, but rather in the give and take of spontaneous argument, in the testing of ideas against the minds of others, in the dialectical process of thesis and antithesis and synthesis, in the collaborative search for truth through conversation. One of the participants poses a question, often abstract and theoretical, the kind of question that has no obvious practical application. What is justice? How can we distinguish between just and unjust actions, between just and unjust laws? What is the nature of love, of eros? Is it fundamentally physical, a desire for beauty and pleasure? Or is it something higher, a desire for the eternal and the good? How should a man live? What is the purpose of human existence? What makes an action virtuous? Can virtue be taught, or is it inborn? The conversation begins lightly, playfully, with jokes and anecdotes and examples drawn from mythology or from history or from everyday experience. But it deepens as the evening progresses, as the wine continues to flow and the normal social constraints and hesitations begin to relax, as men begin to speak more freely and honestly, to admit to ignorance and confusion, to challenge each other more directly and forcefully. Positions are articulated and defended, arguments are constructed with care, premises stated, logical steps traced, conclusions drawn, contradictions are identified and exploited. Weak points in reasoning are probed and attacked, ideas are built up and then torn down, and then rebuilt in modified form. The wine lubricates the process, creates a space where social hierarchies are temporarily suspended, where ideas can be pursued wherever they lead without fear of giving offense or overstepping boundaries. This is the birthplace of dialectic, the structured method of philosophical inquiry through dialogue that Socrates will make famous and that will become one of the defining characteristics of Greek and later Western philosophy. The idea that truth emerges not from individual contemplation in isolation, but from the clash of competing perspectives, from the friction of minds rubbing against each other. But the symposium is not always deadly serious, not always focused exclusively on abstract philosophical questions. There is light-hearted entertainment as well. Music is provided by an auletress, a flute girl, usually a hired slave, who plays softly in the background, her notes weaving through the conversation, providing a sonic texture without demanding attention. There are games, sometimes of physical skill like kottabos, where the participants flick the dregs of wine remaining in their cups at a small target, trying to knock over a delicately balanced disc, winning points for accuracy and losing points for misses, competing against each other in a contest that requires surprising dexterity and concentration, especially as the evening wears on and coordination begins to suffer. There is poetry, either recited from memory, drawing on the vast store of verses that every educated man knows, passages from Homer or Hesiod or Sappho or Pindar, or any of the dozens of other poets whose works are part of the common cultural inheritance, or sometimes improvised on the spot, composed extempore in response to a challenge or as a gift to another participant, demonstrating wit and verbal facility. And there is desire, sexual desire, which is openly acknowledged and discussed and sometimes acted upon. The symposium is an exclusively male space, and the relationships that form here, the bonds that develop, are complex and multifaceted and deeply embedded in the social structure of Athens. It is common, accepted, even celebrated within carefully defined boundaries, for older men to take younger men as lovers, a practice that modern people find difficult to understand without anachronistic and misleading comparisons. The older man, the Erastes, the lover, is expected to be the active partner, the mentor, the teacher, the one who guides and shapes and educates the younger Eromenos, the beloved, in his development as a person and as a future citizen. The relationship is supposed to be primarily educational and formative, not merely or even primarily sexual, though the sexual component is certainly present and acknowledged. The younger partner, ideally, is supposed to be receptive to the older man's guidance and wisdom, to learn from him, to model himself on him, to benefit from his experience and his knowledge. The relationship should be characterized by mutual affection and respect, not by coercion or exploitation. When the younger man reaches full adulthood, typically in his 20s, the relationship is expected to evolve or end, and he in turn may take on the role of Erastes to a younger man, continuing the cycle, passing on what he has learned. This is yet another aspect of Athenian life that seems alien, troubling even, to modern sensibilities shaped by very different cultural norms and assumptions. But it is part of the fabric of this world, part of how elite men relate to each other, how knowledge and values are transmitted from one generation to the next, how bonds of loyalty and affection are formed that will last throughout their lives. Now let us focus our attention on the single figure who will become the most famous, most influential, and most controversial philosopher in Athens, indeed in all of Western history. Though he will never write a single word, never establish a formal school, never charge a fee for his teaching, and will die condemned by the very city he loved and served. Socrates is no longer a young man, he is in his 60s now, his body thickened by age and a lifetime of hard living, his face weather-beaten and deeply lined, marked by decades of outdoor life and military service and constant questioning. He is famously ugly, with a snub nose, thick lips, protruding eyes, a general appearance that contemporaries often compare, not kindly, to a satyr or a Silenus, those grotesque figures from mythology. He served as a hoplite in the Athenian army in his youth and middle age, fought with distinction in several major battles during the earlier phases of the Peloponnesian War, and his physical courage and his endurance were noted and remembered by his fellow soldiers. But his military service is long past. Now he spends his days doing something that seems to many people both puzzling and annoying. He walks slowly through the agora, stopping anyone who will listen to him, engaging them in conversation, asking them questions that seem simple but turn out to be impossibly complex. He does not ask practical questions about prices, or politics, or the weather, or any of the normal topics of everyday conversation. He asks philosophical questions, questions about the nature and the foundations of things, about concepts that everyone uses, but no one has seriously examined. What is courage? Not just what are examples of courageous behavior, which anyone can list, but what is the essential nature of courage itself, the thing that makes all courageous acts courageous? What is piety? What does it mean to be pious, to act rightly toward the gods? What is knowledge as opposed to mere opinion or belief? What is virtue? What is justice? At first, to the person being questioned, the answers seem obvious, easy, the kind of thing everyone knows without having to think about it. Everyone knows what courage is. It's standing your ground in battle, not running away, facing danger without flinching. But then Socrates presses, asks follow-up questions, demands definitions that are both clear and comprehensive, asks for consistency between different examples and different cases, and slowly, gradually, often painfully, the initial easy answer falls apart under examination. Courage is not just standing your ground in battle, because sometimes the truly courageous thing to do is to retreat in order to fight another day. Courage is not just enduring hardship, because a fool or a madman can endure hardship without being courageous. So what exactly is courage? What is the essential defining characteristic that all instances of courage share, and that no non-courageous act possesses? The person who thought they understood what courage means, who has used the word confidently their entire life, suddenly discovers that they cannot explain it clearly, cannot define it in a way that covers all cases without contradiction, cannot articulate what they thought they knew. This is the famous Socratic method, the elenchus, the process of cross-examination and refutation, and it is deeply, profoundly unsettling to those who experience it. Socrates insistently claims that he is not teaching anything, that he has no wisdom or knowledge to impart to others. He says that the only thing he knows is that he knows nothing, that he is ignorant, and that this recognition of his own ignorance is what makes him wiser than other men who falsely believe they know things they do not actually know. He is not a sophist, he emphasizes repeatedly, not one of those traveling professional teachers who charge fees, often substantial fees, to teach rhetoric and persuasion and the art of making the weaker argument appear the stronger. He charges nothing, he offers nothing, except questions. He has no school, no curriculum, no formal course of instruction. All he does, all he claims to do, is ask questions and examine the answers that people give. But of course his questions are not innocent or neutral. They are carefully designed, honed by years of practice, intended to expose hidden assumptions, to reveal contradictions, to strip away the veneer of false certainty, to force people to think more carefully, more rigorously, more honestly, about fundamental concepts they have always taken completely for granted. He often compares himself to a gadfly, a stinging insect that bites a lazy horse to keep it awake and moving, to prevent it from becoming sluggish and complacent. Athens, he suggests, is the horse, large and powerful but in danger of falling asleep, and he is the gadfly, sent by the gods. He actually believes this, that his mission is divinely ordained, to sting his fellow citizens into wakeful awareness, to make them think, to disturb their comfortable assumptions. And as you might imagine, many people find this experience of being publicly questioned and shown to be ignorant deeply annoying, even humiliating. Socrates develops a reputation as a troublemaker, a pest, someone who makes people look foolish in front of their friends and neighbors. He undermines the confidence of young men in their fathers and teachers. He questions the traditional values and the traditional stories about the gods, suggesting that perhaps the poets have misrepresented the gods, that perhaps the divine is very different from what people have been taught to believe. He makes people uncomfortable, makes them question things they would prefer to leave unquestioned. And yet, despite the discomfort and the annoyance and sometimes the outright hostility he generates, Socrates has devoted followers, primarily young men from wealthy aristocratic families who are drawn to him like iron filings to a magnet. They find his relentless questioning exhilarating rather than threatening. They see in him a model of intellectual courage and integrity and honesty, a man who is willing to follow an argument wherever it leads regardless of the consequences, even if it leads to conclusions that are uncomfortable or unpopular or dangerous. They gather around him whenever he appears in the agora, listening to his conversations, trying to learn his method, attempting to imitate his technique. Socrates is not interested in conventional politics, at least not in the way that most Athenians are interested in politics. He does not actively seek public office. He does not regularly give speeches at the assembly, though he attends as a citizen and votes on the proposals brought before the people. He served on the Council of 500 once, chosen by lot like everyone who serves, and during his brief tenure, he performed one memorable act of moral courage. He alone, out of the entire council, refused to cooperate with a mob demanding an illegal mass execution of generals who had failed to rescue survivors after a naval battle. He stood alone against enormous pressure, risking his own life by his refusal, and he prevented an injustice from being carried out. But he does not seek such positions of power or responsibility. His mission, as he understands it, is different and more fundamental. He is asking what it means to live a good life, what it means to be truly virtuous rather than merely appearing virtuous, what the city should value if it wants to be truly just rather than merely powerful. And his method of constant questioning, his refusal to accept easy answers or conventional wisdom, is in its own way deeply political, a challenge to every form of unexamined authority. He is not trying to overthrow the democracy through violence or conspiracy. He is trying to make it better, to make its citizens more thoughtful, more self-aware, more capable of wise judgment. But Athens, especially Athens under the strain and trauma of a long devastating war, will not see it that way. His questions will increasingly be seen as a threat to social stability and cohesion. He will be viewed as someone who is undermining the foundations of society, corrupting the youth, disrespecting the gods, and endangering the city through his relentless criticism. And in a few years, when he is 70 years old, he will be put on trial for his life, accused of impiety and of corrupting the young men of Athens. The charges will be vague and difficult to prove, but the jury of 500 citizens will vote to convict him, and he will be sentenced to death. And he will accept that verdict, will refuse opportunities to escape into exile that his wealthy friends will offer him, because he believes in the rule of law, believes that a citizen has an obligation to obey the laws of his city even when those laws produce unjust results, believes that to flee would be to betray everything he has taught and lived for. He will drink the hemlock, the poison that will kill him slowly over the course of an hour, and he will die surrounded by his students in a prison cell, still talking, still questioning, still pursuing truth, until his last breath. His death will become one of the defining moments in the history of philosophy, a symbol that will be endlessly discussed and reinterpreted, an image of the conflict between the individual and the state, between the pursuit of truth and the demands of conventional morality, between reason and tradition. After Socrates is executed, his most devoted student, a young aristocratic man named Plato, will be devastated, unable to remain in the city that has murdered his beloved teacher. Plato is from one of the most prominent families in Athens, related through his mother to Solon, the legendary lawgiver, and through various other connections to the aristocratic and oligarchic faction that has sometimes opposed the democracy. He is brilliant, highly educated, and deeply idealistic. He has listened to Socrates for years, has absorbed his method, has witnessed his trial and his death, and the injustice of that death. The fact that the democracy, which Plato already views with suspicion as ruled by the ignorant mob, could condemn the wisest and best man in Athens, will shape everything Plato thinks and writes for the rest of his long life. After Socrates' execution, Plato will leave Athens, will travel to Egypt and to Sicily and to southern Italy, seeking knowledge, mourning, trying to process what has happened and what it means. And when he finally returns to Athens years later, he will found the Academy, a school of philosophy that will endure for 900 years, that will become the model for all later institutions of higher learning in the Western world. At the Academy, Plato will develop and teach his theory of forms, his most influential and most controversial philosophical doctrine. He will argue that the physical world we perceive through our senses is not the true reality, is not fully real at all, but is merely a pale shadow, an imperfect and constantly changing copy of a higher reality that exists in a realm beyond the physical. In this higher realm exist the forms, eternal and unchanging and perfect ideas or patterns, of which all physical things are merely temporary and imperfect instances. When you see a beautiful flower, or a just action, or a good deed, you are not seeing beauty or justice or goodness themselves. You are seeing only a particular instance, a momentary reflection, a shadow cast by the eternal forms that exist independent of space and time. True knowledge, for Plato, is not knowledge of the physical world, which is always changing and never fully knowable. True knowledge is knowledge of the forms, and such knowledge can be attained not through sense perception, but only through reason, through philosophical contemplation, through the kind of dialectical questioning that Socrates practiced. This theory of forms is the foundation of what will come to be called metaphysics, the branch of philosophy that studies the nature of reality itself, that asks what truly exists, and what only appears to exist, what is real, and what is merely apparent. And this Platonic vision of reality, with its emphasis on a perfect world beyond this imperfect one, will profoundly influence Western philosophy and Western religion for the next 2,000 years, will shape how people think about the relationship between the material and the spiritual, the temporal and the eternal. But Plato is not the only important philosophical voice to emerge from Athens. There is another, very different mind at work, one that will ultimately prove just as influential. Aristotle is not yet in Athens at this moment. He will arrive later, as a young man from Macedon, from the northern frontier that most Greeks regard as barely civilized. And he will study at Plato's academy for 20 years, absorbing everything his teacher has to offer. But eventually Aristotle will break with Plato, will find his teacher's theory of forms too abstract, too disconnected from the actual world of experience, too focused on some imagined realm beyond the senses. Aristotle will leave the academy after Plato's death and will eventually found his own school in Athens, the Lyceum, named after the gymnasium near which it is located. And at the Lyceum, Aristotle will develop a philosophy that is in many ways the opposite of Plato's, a philosophy based not on transcendent forms, but on careful empirical observation of the world as it actually is. Aristotle is interested in everything, and he will write about everything. He will study biology, collecting and dissecting hundreds of different species of animals, cataloging their similarities and differences, looking for patterns and relationships, creating the first systematic taxonomy of the natural world. He will study physics, trying to understand motion and change and causation, developing theories that will dominate scientific thinking until the scientific revolution 2,000 years later. He will study ethics, asking how human beings should live, what constitutes a good life, what virtues we should cultivate, concluding that virtue is a mean between extremes, that courage lies between cowardice and recklessness, that the good life requires both contemplation and action. He will study politics, comparing the constitutions of more than 100 different city-states, analyzing what makes governments stable or unstable, just or unjust, arguing that the best constitution is a mixed one that balances the interests of different classes. He will invent formal logic, creating a system of syllogistic reasoning that will be used to teach students how to think clearly for the next 2 millennia. He will write on poetry and rhetoric, on meteorology and astronomy, on psychology and economics. His vast body of work, much of it preserved through medieval Arabic translations and rediscovered by medieval European scholars, will define the structure of knowledge, the division of inquiry into different fields and disciplines, for centuries to come. But all of this is still in the future. For now, in the streets and squares of 5th century Athens, the ideas are still forming, still fluid, still being tested in conversation and debate, developed by men who do not yet know that they are laying the foundations for Western philosophy. The sun is setting now, and you make your way through the darkening streets one more time toward the Theatre of Dionysus, which sits on the southern slope of the Acropolis. The theatre season is approaching, and all of Athens is preparing for the Great Dionysia, the annual festival in honor of Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy and transformation. The theatre is a vast semicircular amphitheatre carved directly into the hillside, with rows of stone benches rising steeply from the circular dancing floor, the orchestra at the bottom. The benches are hard and uncomfortable, just flat stone without backs or cushions, but they can accommodate 15,000 people, or perhaps even more, making the theatre one of the largest gathering spaces in the city. When the festival comes, virtually the entire population will attend. Men, women, metics, even slaves are permitted to watch, though they sit in carefully separated sections with the social hierarchy clearly maintained even in this communal space. The theatre is not entertainment in our modern sense, not something you choose to attend when you feel like having a pleasant evening out. It is a civic and religious duty, an essential part of what it means to belong to the polis. To attend the theatre is to participate in the collective life of the city, to be reminded of the stories and the values that bind the community together, to experience together the fundamental questions and experiences of human existence. The plays performed at the Great Dionysia are not light or escapist. They deal with the most difficult, most painful, most fundamental questions that human beings face. The tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides explore the darkest corners of human experience. Aeschylus writes about families destroyed by hereditary curses and cycles of blood revenge, about how violence begets violence across generations until some form of justice or reconciliation can be found. His Aristea trilogy traces the curse on the house of Atreus from the murder of Agamemnon by his wife Clytemnestra, through the revenge murder of Clytemnestra by her son Orestes, to the final resolution when Orestes is tried in Athens before a jury of citizens and the cycle of violence is finally broken through the establishment of law. Sophocles writes about the power of fate and the limits of human knowledge and control. His Aristippus the King is the story of a man who tries desperately to escape a terrible prophecy and in trying to escape it brings it about, who discovers in the worst possible way that he has unknowingly killed his father and married his mother, and who must somehow continue to live with that knowledge. Euripides writes with psychological insight about characters driven to extremes by passion or betrayal or impossible choices. His Medea is the story of a woman who, abandoned by her husband Jason for a younger bride, murders her own children to punish him, an act so horrifying that audiences recoil from it. And yet Euripides makes us understand, if not sympathize with her rage and her pain. The comedies of Aristophanes are the other side of the theatrical experience, wild and crude and political and hilarious. Aristophanes mocks everyone and everything, and nothing is sacred. In Lysistrata, the women of Athens and Sparta go on a sex strike to force their husbands to end the war. In The Clouds, Socrates is portrayed as a fraudulent sophist who teaches students to cheat their creditors. In The Birds, two Athenian men escape the city entirely and build a utopian state in the sky with the birds, blockading heaven and starving the gods until they agree to better terms. The comedy is outrageous, full of slapstick and sexual jokes and political satire, but it is also serious social criticism, holding up the city's pretensions and hypocrisies and failures to merciless ridicule. The theatre creates a space where the city can reflect on itself, can explore its deepest fears and hopes, can ask the questions that matter most. For a few days each year, all of Athens sits together in this stone amphitheatre, and watches the same plays, laughs at the same jokes, weeps at the same tragedies, is moved by the same stories. The theatre creates community, creates shared experience, creates a sense of collective identity that is as important as the assembly or the law courts in making Athens what it is. But war is coming, inexorable as fate. The rivalry with Sparta, simmering for decades, is about to explode. This is not just a conflict between two powerful cities competing for dominance. It is a clash of worldviews, of fundamentally incompatible ways of organizing human society. Athens represents democracy, however flawed and limited. It represents openness to new ideas, celebration of individual achievement, naval power, commercial enterprise, intellectual and artistic freedom. Sparta represents oligarchy, rigid social hierarchy, military discipline carried to an extreme that modern people find difficult to comprehend. Suspicion of outsiders and new ideas, land power, agricultural self-sufficiency, stability through repression. The smaller Greek city-states are forced to choose sides, to align themselves with one power or the other, and in choosing sides they guarantee that the coming conflict will engulf all of Greece. The Peloponnesian War begins in 431 BCE and will continue with only brief interruptions for 27 years, an entire generation of destruction and death. Athens' strategy, crafted by Pericles, is to avoid fighting Sparta's superior army on land while using naval superiority to maintain supply lines and to raid Spartan territory. The rural population of Attica crowds inside the long walls, abandoning farms and homes. Then comes the plague, swift and merciless, killing perhaps a third of the population, including Pericles himself. The war continues through periods of victory and defeat, through temporary peace and resumed conflict. Then comes the catastrophe of Sicily, where Athens sends its greatest expedition ever assembled to conquer the wealthy Greek cities there and loses everything: Aeneas' fleet destroyed, thousands of soldiers killed or enslaved in Sicilian quarries. The balance of power shifts. Sparta, with Persian gold, builds a fleet, subject cities revolt. And finally, in 405 BCE, at Aegospotami, the Spartan fleet destroys the last Athenian navy. Athens is besieged, starved into submission. In 404 BCE, Athens surrenders. The long walls are torn down to the sound of flute music, symbolically dismantling the power that made Athens great. The democracy is abolished, replaced by the 30 tyrants, a brutal oligarchic regime imposed by Sparta. For months, Athens is ruled by terror, political enemies executed without trial, property confiscated, the assembly silenced. But within a year, democrats and exiles fight back, overthrow the 30, restore the democracy. Yet Athens will never regain its former power. The empire is gone, the fleet a shadow, the treasury empty. But remarkably, astonishingly, Athens remains the intellectual center of Greece. The philosophers continue teaching, the theaters continue performing. The ideas born here continue to spread outward like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. But the age of the independent city-state is ending. Though the Greeks do not yet fully understand this, a new power is rising in the north, in Macedon, long dismissed by the southern Greeks as a backward kingdom barely worthy of the name Greek. King Philip II of Macedon is transforming his kingdom into the most formidable military power the Greek world has ever seen. He is creating a professional standing army, not citizen militias that gather when needed and then disperse. He is innovating with the phalanx, giving his infantry longer pikes called sarissas, creating a formation that is virtually invincible against traditional hoplite armies. He is developing cavalry tactics that no one can match. He is also a master diplomat, using bribery and promises and manipulation to divide his potential enemies. He plays the Greek city-states against each other with consummate skill, always positioning himself as a mediator, a friend of Greece, a defender of Greek interests against the barbarians, while all the time tightening his grip. Some Athenians see the danger clearly. Demosthenes, the greatest orator of the age, delivers speech after passionate speech warning that Philip is a tyrant who will destroy Greek freedom. He calls for unity, for resistance, for preparation for war while there is still time. He travels to other cities, trying to forge an alliance. But many Athenians are tired, war-weary, desperately wanting peace and prosperity. They want to believe Philip's reassurances. They convince themselves that he will respect Greek autonomy, that he is a benefactor rather than a threat. And so they do too little too late. When the crisis finally comes, when Philip marches south in 338 BCE with his army, the hastily assembled coalition of Athens and Thebes and a few other cities is no match for the Macedonian war machine. At Chæronea, the Greeks are crushed. Philip's 18-year-old son Alexander commands the cavalry and performs brilliantly, a preview of what is to come. The age of the free city-state is over. Greece is now subject to Macedon. Philip is magnanimous in victory. He does not destroy Athens, does not enslave its population, does not even dismantle its democracy. He respects Greek culture deeply. After all, he has hired Aristotle himself as tutor for young Alexander. But he makes it absolutely clear that Athens' independence in foreign policy is finished. The city must accept Macedonian hegemony, and then in 336 BCE, before he can complete his plans, Philip is assassinated at his daughter's wedding, murdered by one of his own bodyguards for reasons that remain mysterious. His son Alexander, barely 20 years old, inherits the throne and immediately faces revolts throughout his kingdom and in Greece. Some cities, thinking this boy king will be weak, declare their independence. Athens hesitates, debates, considers joining the rebellion. Alexander moves with shocking speed, marches south, appears before the walls of Thebes and offers terms. When Thebes refuses, he obliterates the city, razes it to the ground, sells the survivors into slavery, sparing only the temples and the house where the poet Pindar once lived. It is a calculated act of terror, a message to all Greece. Athens gets the message and submits. And then Alexander does something that will change world history. He takes his father's army and marches east against the Persian Empire, the vast realm that stretches from the Mediterranean to India, the superpower that has dominated the region for 2 centuries. In just 10 years of campaigning, Alexander will conquer it all. He defeats the Persian king Darius in battle after battle. He conquers Egypt and is proclaimed pharaoh. He marches into Mesopotamia, takes Babylon and Susa and Persepolis. He continues east into what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan. He reaches India, defeats Indian kings, and would go farther, but his exhausted army finally refuses to continue. He dies in Babylon in 323 BCE, not yet 33 years old, probably of fever though some suspect poison, having conquered the known world. Alexander's conquests create a new world, the Hellenistic world, where Greek culture spreads across 3 continents. Greek becomes the language of administration and trade from Egypt to India. Greek cities are founded throughout the conquered territories. Greek philosophy and art and architecture spread everywhere. This is the beginning of the Hellenistic Age, which will last for 3 centuries until Rome conquers the eastern Mediterranean and absorbs these Greek kingdoms into its own empire. But Athens itself, the original source of all this cultural power, is no longer the center. That role shifts to Alexandria in Egypt with its great library, to Pergamum and Antioch and other new cities. Athens becomes what it will remain for centuries, a university town, a place where wealthy young men from across the Mediterranean world come to study philosophy, to attend the academy or the lyceum or one of the other schools, to walk in the footsteps of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. It is respected, even revered, but it is no longer a major political or military power. The energy, the creativity, the sense of possibility have moved elsewhere. Now let us draw our journey to a close. You stand one final time in the agora as twilight deepens into night. The shops have closed. The crowds have dispersed. A few men still linger in conversation, their voices low and thoughtful. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, Socrates is still asking his questions. In a few years he will be gone, executed by the city he loved. But his questions will live on, preserved in the writings of Plato, inspiring generations of thinkers. This is Athens. This is where Western civilization begins, where democracy is invented, where philosophy is born, where reason first becomes a tool for understanding the world rather than merely myth and tradition. The city is flawed, deeply flawed. Its democracy excludes most of its population. Its freedom rests on slavery. Its enlightenment coexists with superstition. But the ideas it generates, the questions it asks, will shape human thought for millennia to come. Every time we ask what justice means, every time we demand a voice in our government, every time we question authority or search for truth through reason, we are the heirs of Athens. The Acropolis rises in the darkness now, the Parthenon barely visible, a shadow against the stars. The city sleeps. But the ideas born here never sleep. They echo through the centuries, unchanged and unchanging, as relevant today as they were 2,500 years ago. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through ancient Athens. May you carry its questions with you into your dreams, and may you wake with the courage to seek your own answers. Until we meet again in the past, rest well and sleep in the light of reason.